Step outside, now.
Officer, this is my home. I'm not stepping out without cause.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
I haven't done anything.
You don't have a warrant. I know my rights.
Dispatch, requesting backup at my location.
Officer Garrett Holt, get down now. Judge Elena Vance, IAM, not resisting. This is my home. Husband David, what did you do? You just tasted a judge. Officer Garrett Holt, dispatch, send backup. Suspect secured. Officer Garrett Holt, badge number 5921 of the Magnolia County Police Department, made the worst decision of his 12-year career when he saw a black woman watering her garden in an upscale neighborhood and decided something didn't look right. He circled back 20 minutes later, approached the residence with his hand hovering near his weapon, and when Judge Elena Vance answered her own front door in her Howard University sweatshirt, Holt demanded she step outside for questioning without any legal justification. When Elena, a retired Superior Court judge with 30 years on the bench, calmly refused and cited her Fourth Amendment rights, Holt forced his way into the doorway and deployed his taser, sending 50,000 volts through Elena's body while she stood in her own entryway. What Holt didn't know was that the Ring doorbell camera had captured every second in crystal clear HD with perfect audio, that this footage would go viral within 24 hours, and that his moment of racial bias would lead to an $8.5 million lawsuit that would cost him his badge, his pension, and everything he owned. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe no one should be tasered at their own front door for simply asserting their rights, then make sure you like this video and subscribe. Elena Vance had spent 30 years behind the bench, and every single one of those years had taught her the same fundamental truth. The Constitution wasn't just a dusty document locked away in some museum in Washington. It was living, breathing protection that separated a free society from tyranny. She'd seen it firsthand. Watched how the Fourth Amendment could stand between an innocent citizen and an overzealous government, how the Sixth Amendment gave voice to the voiceless, and how the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause was supposed to mean exactly what it said. Supposed to. When she retired at 70, Elena didn't retreat to some quiet condo in Florida, like so many of her colleagues. She and her husband David had other plans. David was a Vietnam veteran, a man who'd spent 13 months in the Mekong Delta, defending the very freedoms Elena had spent her career interpreting and protecting. He used to joke that he'd fought for the Constitution overseas while she'd fought for it in the courtroom, and together they'd made a pretty good team. After his passing 2 years earlier, Elena had promised herself she'd honor his memory by living the American dream they'd always talked about. A beautiful home with a garden. A place where she could finally tend to roses instead of case files, where the only briefs she'd read would be grocery lists. The house on Magnolia Lane was everything they'd dreamed of. A classic colonial with white columns framing the front porch, black shutters that stood crisp against cream-colored siding, and a front yard that rolled gently down to the street like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people still waved to each other, where kids rode bikes without helmets because everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual 4th of July block party. When Elena closed on the property in March of 2024, she stood in the driveway with the keys in her hand and actually cried. Not sad tears, joyful ones. She'd made it. A black girl from the South Side who'd put herself through law school waiting tables had just bought a house that would have been completely off limits to someone who looked like her just 60 years earlier. The neighbors welcomed her immediately. Martha from next door brought over a casserole and a list of the best local contractors. Tom and Susan across the street invited her to the neighborhood watch meetings. Even the mailman, a cheerful guy named Rick, had commented on how nice it was to see the old Henderson place finally occupied again. Elena had laughed and told him she planned to be there until they carried her out, and she'd meant it. This wasn't just a house, it was a declaration. It was proof that the system worked, that hard work and dedication still mattered, that the American dream wasn't just a marketing slogan but a real tangible thing you could touch and water and watch bloom. She'd thrown herself into making the place her own. The first thing she did was plant a garden. David had always wanted one, had talked endlessly about growing tomatoes and peppers and maybe some herbs for cooking. Elena didn't have his green thumb, but she was determined to try. She bought books, watched YouTube videos, and joined a local gardening club. By early summer, she had a respectable showing of hydrangeas along the front walkway, some cheerful marigolds bordering the driveway, and a vegetable patch in the back that was actually producing edible food. Every morning she'd walk outside in her robe, coffee in hand, and just marvel at the fact that this was hers. All hers. Bought and paid for, with 3 decades of public service. The house itself became her sanctuary. She'd furnished it carefully, mixing pieces she and David had collected over the years with new items that reflected her personal taste. The living room featured a cream-colored sofa that faced a fireplace she actually used, even in the mild winters. The walls throughout the home displayed her framed diplomas and judicial commendations, her law degree from Howard University, her appointment to the bench, various awards for community service and legal excellence. They weren't there to brag. They were there to remind her of the journey, of how far she'd come from that scared first-year law student who'd wondered if she was smart enough, tough enough, good enough to make it in a profession that didn't always look kindly on women who looked like her. The kitchen was her favorite room. She'd had it renovated immediately, installing white shaker cabinets, granite countertops, and a huge farmhouse sink that David would have loved. She'd started cooking again, really cooking, not just reheating takeout between court sessions. She'd invite friends over for Sunday dinners, would experiment with recipes her mother had made, would sit at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, and feel genuinely, completely at peace. This was what retirement was supposed to feel like. This was the reward for a lifetime of service, of showing up every day even when it was hard, of believing that justice actually mattered. She'd installed the Ring doorbell in April, mostly because Martha next door had one and recommended it. Elena wasn't paranoid about crime. Magnolia Lane was one of the safest streets in the county, but she liked the idea of being able to see who was at her door when she was upstairs or in the garden. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, a small piece of modern technology that gave her a bit of extra security. She had no idea that a little camera would become the most important witness in her life, that it would capture something so outrageous, so unconstitutional, so fundamentally un-American, that it would make national news and force the country to confront uncomfortable truths about who gets to feel safe in their own home. Garrett Holt had been wearing a badge for 12 years, and if you asked anyone in the Magnolia County Police Department, they'd tell you he'd been a problem for at least 10 of them. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small things that added up if you were paying attention. A complaint here about excessive force during a traffic stop. A report there about unprofessional conduct at a domestic disturbance call. Civilians claimed he was rude, dismissive, quick to escalate situations that should have been simple conversations. The kind of red flags that good departments catch early and address before they become disasters. But Magnolia County wasn't a good department. It was an understaffed, underfunded operation that valued bodies in uniforms over quality control. They needed officers on the street, and Garrett Holt showed up for his shifts, filled out his paperwork mostly on time, and hadn't done anything so egregious that it required immediate termination. His personnel file was thick with citizen complaints, but thin on actual discipline. A verbal warning here, a mandatory retraining there, but nothing that ever really stuck or changed his behavior. His supervisors would shake their heads, tell him to tone it down, and then send him right back out onto the streets because they didn't have anyone else to cover his sector. The complaints followed a pattern if you looked closely enough, which nobody in the department ever really did. Garrett had a particular problem with people he perceived as not belonging. It showed up again and again in the incident reports. A Hispanic man pulled over in a nice neighborhood and was subjected to a 40-minute interrogation about whether the car was stolen, even though the registration clearly showed he was the owner. A black teenager stopped while walking through a suburban area and questioned what he was doing there, even though the kid lived 3 houses down and was literally walking home from school. A Middle Eastern family detained during a traffic stop and subjected to questions about terrorism that had absolutely nothing to do with the broken taillight that had prompted the initial stop. Garrett's worldview was simple and ugly. Certain people belonged in certain places, and when he saw someone who didn't fit his narrow mental image of who should be where, he felt entitled, no, obligated to investigate. He saw himself as a guardian, protecting nice neighborhoods from people who had no business being there. He never thought of himself as racist. If you'd asked him directly, he would have been offended by the suggestion. He'd tell you he didn't see color, that he just had good instincts for spotting criminals, that his job was to keep communities safe, and sometimes that meant asking hard questions. The fact that his hard questions were almost exclusively directed at people of color never seemed to register as significant to him. His fellow officers knew what he was. Some of them avoided partnering with him because they didn't want to be associated with his complaints. Others, the ones who shared his views or at least didn't object to them, would go out drinking with him after shifts and listen to him rant about how the job had changed, how you couldn't do real police work anymore without someone screaming about civil rights, how the department was too worried about political correctness to let officers do what needed to be done. He had a particular contempt for judges, especially federal judges, who he saw as bleeding heart liberals more concerned with protecting criminals than supporting law enforcement. He'd never say it out loud in an official setting, but after a few beers, he'd tell anyone who'd listen that half the judges in the country should be arrested for obstruction of justice. On the morning of June 15, 2024, Garrett Holt was cruising through the neighborhoods on the north side of the county, the expensive side, where houses started at $500,000 and went up from there. It was a Saturday, his normal day off, but he'd picked up an overtime shift because his wife had been on him about money again. His mood was already sour when he turned onto Magnolia Lane around 11 in the morning and saw something that caught his attention. A black woman in her front yard, wearing a Howard University sweatshirt and jeans, watering flowers with a garden hose. Garrett slowed his patrol car and watched her for a moment. The house was clearly expensive, one of those classic colonials with the big columns and the perfect landscaping. The woman looked to be in her 60s or 70s, moving slowly, carefully tending to the plants along the walkway. Everything about the scene should have screamed homeowner doing yard work on a Saturday morning, but that's not what Garrett saw. He saw a black woman in a neighborhood where he didn't think black women should be, at least not as residents. Maybe she was a housekeeper, he thought, though that didn't quite fit. Housekeepers didn't usually water the flowers, and they definitely didn't wear college sweatshirts while doing it. He circled the block, his mind working through possibilities. Maybe she was visiting someone. Maybe she was a relative staying at the house. Maybe she was chasing the place, looking for an opportunity to break in later. That last thought gained traction in his mind, fueled by years of prejudice and a fundamental inability to see black people as belonging in spaces he associated with wealth and success. By the time he completed his loop and came back around to Magnolia Lane, he'd convinced himself that something wasn't right, that his instincts were telling him to investigate, that this was exactly the kind of proactive policing that kept neighborhoods safe. He parked his cruiser at the curb 3 houses down and watched. The woman had finished with the hose and was now examining some of the plants more closely, deadheading spent blooms, adjusting a few stakes that were supporting taller flowers. She moved with the casual confidence of someone completely at home, someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. But Garrett's mind had already made its judgment. He waited 15 minutes, watching, building his case in his head. When she finally started walking toward the front door, he made his decision. He pulled his cruiser up to the house and stepped out, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his duty belt near his weapon. It was a habit, one he developed over years of treating every interaction as a potential threat. He walked up the driveway with purpose, his shoulders squared, his face set in what he thought was professional authority but what actually read as aggressive intimidation. The woman had just reached her front porch when he called out to her, his voice carrying that particular tone cops use when they've already decided you're guilty of something, and they're just going through the motions of finding out what. What Garrett Holt didn't know as he approached that house was that he was about to make the kind of mistake that ends careers and destroys lives. He didn't know he was walking up to a retired Superior Court judge who knew the Constitution better than he knew his own name. He didn't know that the Ring doorbell camera mounted above the door was already recording, capturing every word, every gesture, every violation of civil rights that was about to unfold. And he definitely didn't know that his decision to see criminality, where there was only gardening, would cost him everything he had and serve as a warning to every other officer who thought the badge made them above the law. Elena had just stepped onto her porch, garden gloves still on her hands and dirt on her knees from kneeling in the flower bed, when she heard the voice behind her. It was that particular tone that every black person in America recognizes instantly, the one that says you're already guilty, and the person using it is just waiting for you to confirm their suspicions. She turned around slowly, taking in the patrol car at her curb and the officer striding up her driveway like he owned the place. Her first instinct was confusion. She'd been a judge long enough to know that police officers don't just show up at random houses without a reason. There had to be some kind of call, some complaint, something that had brought him to her address. Maybe one of the neighbors had reported something suspicious, though that seemed unlikely given how welcoming everyone had been. She waited for him to explain, her mind already categorizing this as one of those unfortunate misunderstandings that sometimes happen when you're new to a neighborhood. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice calm and friendly. 30 years on the bench had taught her the value of setting a respectful tone from the start. "Is there something I can help you with?" Garrett Holt stopped at the base of her porch steps, his eyes scanning her in a way that made her skin crawl. It was an assessment, a judgment being made in real time, and Elena could practically see the calculations running through his head. She'd seen that look before, usually from the witness stand, usually from defendants who were about to lie through their teeth. "I need to ask you some questions," he said, his hand still resting near his weapon. "Were you just in this yard?" The question was so absurd that Elena almost laughed. "Yes," she said, pulling off her garden gloves and gesturing to the flowers she'd just been watering. "I was working in my garden. This is my home." "Your home," Garrett repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. "You live here?" Elena felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else entirely, something she'd hoped she'd never experience, but had always known was possible. She was a black woman in an expensive house, and this officer had decided that combination didn't make sense. Common sense should have told him that a woman watering flowers in her own yard, wearing a college sweatshirt on a Saturday morning, posed zero threat to anyone. Common sense should have told him to simply accept her statement that she lived there and move on. But common sense required treating her as a human being entitled to the presumption of innocence, and that clearly wasn't happening. "Yes, I live here," she said, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel creeping in. "I'm the owner of this property. I bought it in March." Is there a problem? I need to see some ID, Garrett said. And there it was, the demand that had no legal basis whatsoever. He hadn't seen her commit a crime. He hadn't received a call about suspicious activity. He had absolutely no reasonable suspicion that would justify demanding her identification, and they both knew it. Or at least, Elena knew it. She was starting to suspect that Officer Holt either didn't know it or didn't care. On what grounds? Elena asked, and she watched his face change. It was a subtle shift, but she'd seen it 1,000 times in her courtroom. It was the look of someone who was used to automatic compliance, who interpreted questions as challenges, who viewed any assertion of rights as disrespect. His ego was now involved, which meant this was about to get worse before it got better. On the grounds that I'm conducting an investigation, Garrett said, his voice hardening. I need you to provide identification and step down here so we can talk. An investigation into what, exactly? Elena kept her voice level, professional, but inside she was furious. She knew exactly what this was. This was driving while black, walking while black, existing while black, except now it was gardening while black. This was an officer who'd seen her skin color and decided she didn't belong in this neighborhood, in this house, on this property that she'd worked 30 years to afford. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Step down here and provide ID, or we're going to have a problem. Elena stayed exactly where she was, her feet planted firmly on her own front porch. Officer, I'm standing on my private property. You've provided no legal justification for your presence here, no probable cause for an investigation, and no reasonable suspicion that would entitle you to demand my identification. Unless you have a warrant, you have no authority to order me to do anything. She watched his face flush red. His ego couldn't handle being challenged, especially not by a black woman who clearly knew her rights better than he knew his own authority. I saw you in this yard, and I have reason to believe you don't belong here, he said. And there it was, the quiet part said out loud. I've received reports about suspicious activity in this neighborhood. What reports? Elena asked calmly. From whom? When? Because I'm quite confident that my neighbors, all of whom have welcomed me warmly, haven't called in any complaints about me watering my own flowers. That's not your concern, Garrett snapped. Quote, your concern is complying with a lawful order from a police officer. Except it's not a lawful order, Elena said, and she felt a strange sense of déjà vu. How many times had she sat on the bench and listened to defense attorneys argue about unlawful stops, illegal searches, violations of Fourth Amendment rights? How many times had she ruled in favor of defendants whose rights had been trampled by officers who thought the badge made them immune from the Constitution? She'd never imagined she'd be on this side of it, standing on her own porch, being treated like a criminal for having the audacity to exist in a space someone else had decided didn't belong to her. Ma'am, last warning. Step down here now, or I will place you under arrest for obstruction. Elena felt her heart pounding, but kept her voice steady. Officer, I don't know your name, but I'm going to explain something to you very clearly. I am a retired Superior Court judge. I spent 30 years upholding the law, and I know exactly what my rights are. You have no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, and no legal authority to demand that I leave my private property or provide you with identification. If you believe you do, then I suggest you contact your supervisor immediately, because what you're doing right now is a clear violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. She watched him process this information, watched his face cycle through surprise, anger, and then something worse. Wounded pride mixed with contempt. He didn't believe her, or maybe he did believe her and simply didn't care. Either way, his ego was now fully engaged, and Elena recognized with sinking certainty that this man was about to do something incredibly stupid. I don't care if you're the Queen of England, Garrett said, his voice dripping with disdain. You're going to comply, or you're going to jail. Elena stood her ground, her hand moving instinctively to her pocket where her phone was. Then, I'm going to need your badge number and your supervisor's contact information, because what you're about to do is illegal. Badge number 5921, Garrett said, his voice mocking now. And you can talk to my supervisor after you're booked. He took a step toward her porch, and Elena's training kicked in. She knew what was about to happen. She could see it in his body language, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hand was moving toward his taser. This wasn't going to end with a conversation. This was going to end with violence, with her rights being violated, with an officer of the law demonstrating exactly why so many people didn't trust the police. Common sense said a 70-year-old woman watering her garden wasn't a threat. Common sense said a person standing on their own porch, asserting their constitutional rights, wasn't someone who needed to be arrested. But common sense had left this encounter the moment Garrett Holt decided that a black woman couldn't possibly own this house, and now his ego had taken over completely. He was going to make her comply, not because she'd broken any law, but because she dared to question his authority. And in that moment, Elena understood with perfect clarity that the camera above her door was about to capture something that would change both of their lives forever. Elena saw him move toward the porch steps and felt a cold rush of clarity. This was happening. This officer, whose badge number she'd made sure to have him repeat, 5921, burned into her memory now, was actually going to violate her rights on her own property. Everything she'd spent 3 decades defending from the bench was about to be trampled by a man who clearly had no understanding of the Constitution he'd sworn to uphold. "Officer," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used in court when she needed to get a rowdy courtroom under control. "Before you take another step, I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from what's about to be the worst mistake of your career. You are on the threshold of violating the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, and I suggest very strongly that you stop and think about what you're doing." Garrett Holt paused, 1 foot on the bottom step of her porch, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "The Fourth Amendment," he repeated mockingly. "You think you can lecture me about the law?" "I don't think I can lecture you about the law," Elena said calmly. "I know I can. I've been interpreting and applying the Fourth Amendment for longer than you've been a police officer. So let me educate you, since your training clearly failed to cover this material adequately." She could see people starting to emerge on neighboring porches. Martha from next door was standing in her doorway, phone in hand. Tom across the street had come out to his yard, clearly concerned. Good, Elena thought. Witnesses. The more the better. "The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures," Elena continued, her voice carrying across the yard. "It requires that you have probable cause before you can detain someone, search their property, or demand identification. Probable cause means you need specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe a crime has been committed. Not a hunch, not a feeling, not your personal opinion about whether someone looks like they belong in a particular neighborhood." "I have probable cause," Garrett insisted, but his voice lacked conviction now. He was starting to realize this wasn't going the way he'd expected. "No you don't," Elena said flatly. "You have bias. You saw a black woman in an upscale neighborhood and made an assumption based on prejudice, not evidence. You've admitted you received no calls about me. You have no complaint from any neighbor. You've witnessed no criminal activity. You have absolutely no legal justification for being on my property or demanding my identification. I saw you acting suspiciously. I was watering flowers." Elena's voice rose for the first time, genuine anger breaking through her professional composure. "In broad daylight, on a Saturday morning, wearing a college sweatshirt. Which part of that constitutes suspicious behavior, Officer Holt?" He flinched at the use of his name, which she'd read off his badge. "You were loitering. On my own property. You cannot loiter on property you own. That's literally impossible. Do you understand how badly you failed at even the most basic application of the law?" Elena took a breath, trying to regain her composure. Anger wouldn't help here. Facts would. "Let me be very clear about what the Fourth Amendment says, because this is apparently news to you. The threshold of my home, this porch where I'm standing, is protected space. You cannot cross it without my permission, a warrant, or exigent circumstances. Exigent circumstances means active emergency. Someone screaming for help, evidence being destroyed, a fleeing suspect. I'm a 70-year-old woman standing calmly on my porch. There is no emergency. There is no justification for you to cross this threshold. You're refusing to cooperate with a police investigation. There is no legitimate investigation." Elena's voice cracked like a gavel. "You're fishing for a crime that doesn't exist because you can't accept that I have every right to be exactly where I am. My husband fought in Vietnam so that citizens would have these protections. He spent 13 months in the Mekong Delta defending the Constitution, and now you're standing here, wearing that badge, spitting on everything he fought for." She could see her words hitting him, but not in the way she'd hoped. Instead of backing down, he was getting angrier. His ego was too invested now. He'd committed to this course of action in front of witnesses, and admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he'd racially profiled her, that he'd violated her rights, that he was exactly the kind of officer that gave law enforcement a bad name. "The Supreme Court has been crystal clear on this issue," Elena pressed on, hoping against hope that reason might still prevail. "In Payton versus New York, they ruled that police cannot make a warrantless entry into a home unless there's consent or exigent circumstances. In Illinois versus Rodriguez, they clarified what constitutes valid consent. In Florida versus Jardines, they explicitly stated that the front porch of a home is protected by the Fourth Amendment. Every single precedent supports my right to stand here and tell you no. You don't get to come into my home. You don't get to demand my ID without cause. You don't get to violate my rights just because your ego can't handle being told no by a black woman." She'd said it, the quiet part out loud. The racial element that had been humming underneath this entire encounter from the moment he'd first called out to her. She watched his face change, watched anger morph into something uglier, the rage of someone who'd been exposed, whose prejudice had been named and called out in front of witnesses. "Ma'am, step off the porch now or I will remove you by force." Elena felt her blood run cold. He was really gonna do it. After everything she'd said, every legal principle she'd cited, every warning about the consequences, he was actually going to assault her on her own property. She thought about her husband David, about the flag that had draped his coffin, about the belief he'd had that the system worked if good people stood up for it. "Officer Holt," she said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "I am standing on my private property, exercising my Fourth Amendment right to refuse an unlawful order. I am not resisting. I am not threatening you. I am simply asserting my constitutional rights, the same rights my husband fought and nearly died to protect. If you cross this threshold without legal authority, if you lay hands on me without probable cause, you will be committing a federal civil rights violation under Title 42, Section 1983. You will be subject to personal liability. You will lose your qualified immunity because what you're doing is so clearly unlawful that no reasonable officer could believe it's permissible." She saw Martha on her phone now, clearly calling 911. Good. More witnesses, more documentation. This needed to be recorded, needed to be documented, because Elena knew in her bones that what was about to happen would either vindicate everything she believed about justice or confirm every terrible truth about how broken the system really was. "Last warning," Garrett said, and his hand moved to his taser. "The camera above my door is recording everything," Elena said quietly. "Every word you've said, every unlawful order you've given, every violation of my rights. Whatever you do next is going to be preserved in crystal clear HD for the world to see. So I'm asking you one final time, is your ego really worth your career?" For a moment, just a moment, she saw hesitation flicker across his face. But then pride won, the way it always does for men like him. He took another step up onto her porch, crossing the threshold of her private property, without permission, without cause, without any legal justification whatsoever. "You're under arrest for obstruction," he said. "I'm under arrest for asserting my constitutional rights on my own property," Elena corrected him, her voice carrying to every neighbor now gathered to watch. "And every person here is a witness to this civil rights violation." She didn't resist as he reached for her arm, didn't pull away, didn't give him any excuse to escalate further. But she also didn't comply with his illegal order to leave her porch. She simply stood there, a 70-year-old retired judge on her own property, about to be assaulted by an officer who valued his ego more than the Constitution he'd sworn to defend. The threshold is a sacred space in American law. It's not just a physical boundary between outside and inside. It's a constitutional line that separates a citizen's private domain from government authority. For over 200 years, courts have recognized that when you cross someone's threshold without permission, without a warrant, without exigent circumstances, you're not just trespassing, you're violating one of the most fundamental protections in the Bill of Rights. Garrett Holt crossed that threshold on June 15, 2024 at 11:47 a.m., and the Ring doorbell camera captured every frame of it in stunning high definition. Elena Vance stood her ground, her feet planted firmly on her own porch, her hands visible and empty at her sides. She wasn't holding a weapon. She wasn't making threats. She wasn't doing anything except exercising her constitutional right to refuse an unlawful order on her private property. But Garrett's hand was on her arm now, gripping it with enough force that she'd later have bruises in the exact shape of his fingers, and he was trying to pull her forward off the porch. "Get down here now," he growled, his face inches from hers. "I am not resisting arrest," Elena said clearly, her voice steady and calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "But I am not leaving my property voluntarily. What you are doing is illegal." Martha's voice carried from next door. "I'm on the phone with 911. They're sending a supervisor." Garrett's head snapped toward Martha's house, and Elena saw pure fury flash across his face. He'd been exposed, called out, embarrassed in front of witnesses, and now a supervisor was coming. Everything he'd done up to this point could maybe, be explained away as an overzealous mistake. But what he did next would prove that this wasn't about law enforcement at all. This was about ego. This was about a man in uniform who couldn't stand being challenged by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. His free hand went to his taser, and Elena felt her stomach drop. "You're going to tase me?" she asked, incredulous. "For standing on my own porch? You're resisting." "I'm not resisting." Elena's voice rose, genuine fear breaking through now. "I'm standing still. My hands are visible. I'm not fighting you. I'm just refusing to comply with an unlawful order." But the distinction didn't matter to Garrett Holt. In his mind, any refusal to obey was resistance, any assertion of rights was obstruction, any challenge to his authority was a crime worthy of force. He'd pulled the taser from his belt, a black and yellow device that looked deceptively small for something that could deliver 50,000 volts of electricity through a human body. "Get on the ground," he shouted, and Elena realized he was performing now, creating a record that would justify what he was about to do. He was giving commands that would sound reasonable in a police report. commands that would make it seem like he'd given her every opportunity to comply before using force. "I cannot get on the ground from this position without you releasing my arm," Elena said, her legal training kicking in even through the fear. "If you want me to get on the ground, you need to let go of me first." It was a trap, and they both knew it. If he let go, she'd stay on her porch, where she had every legal right to be. If he didn't let go, he couldn't claim she was refusing to comply with his order. So he did the only thing his ego would allow. He escalated. The taser came up, aimed at her center mass, and Elena heard her own voice, calm, clear, almost surreal in its steadiness. "My name is Elena Marie Vance. I am a retired Superior Court judge. I am standing on my own property. I am not armed. I am not resisting. I am exercising my Fourth Amendment rights. What you are about to do is a federal civil rights violation." She said it for the camera, for the record, for the lawsuit that she already knew would follow. She said it because she'd spent 30 years watching defendants try to reconstruct events from faulty memory, and she knew that clear, contemporaneous statements captured on video were worth more than 100 witness testimonies after the fact. And then Garrett Holt, badge number 5921 of the Magnolia County Police Department, fired his taser at a 70-year-old woman standing peacefully on her own front porch. The probes hit her in the abdomen and shoulder, and 50,000 volts of electricity shot through Elena's body in a cycle that lasted 5 seconds but felt like an eternity. Every muscle in her body contracted simultaneously. She couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except experience the most intense, all-consuming pain she'd ever felt in her life. Her legs gave out immediately, and she collapsed onto her porch, her head hitting the wooden boards with a sickening crack that the Ring camera picked up with perfect audio clarity. The electricity stopped, and Elena gasped for air, her entire body trembling violently. She could hear screaming, Martha, and Tom, and someone else she didn't recognize. She could hear Garrett's voice, harsh and loud. "Suspect down. Suspect secured. Send backup. Suspect." She was a suspect now. A retired judge lying on her own porch, tased for the crime of knowing her rights. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't cooperate. The shock had done something to her nervous system, left her weak and disoriented. She could taste blood in her mouth. She'd bitten her tongue during the shock. Her head was throbbing where it had hit the boards. And through it all, she could hear Garrett's voice continuing to narrate for his body camera, creating his own version of events. Suspect refused multiple lawful commands, displayed aggressive behavior, forced deployment of tasers for officer safety. None of it was true. The Ring camera had recorded the truth, had captured every moment of her calm assertion of rights, every illegal order he'd given, every clear statement she'd made about not resisting. But Garrett didn't know about the Ring camera. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was in full self-preservation mode now, already spinning the narrative that would protect him. Elena managed to roll onto her side, her vision swimming. She could see feet now, neighbors gathering at the property line, none of them crossing onto her yard because they understood instinctively that they'd be the next ones tased if they tried to help. She tried to speak, to tell them she was okay, but all that came out was a groan. And then she heard it. The front door of her house bursting open, her husband David's voice. No, wait, that couldn't be right. David was dead, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "What did you do? What the hell did you do?" It wasn't David. It was his brother Thomas, who'd been staying with her for the week to help with some home repairs. Thomas, who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, knew exactly what it meant when an unarmed civilian was tased on their own property. Thomas, whose voice carried 30 years of military authority and barely controlled rage. "You just tased a judge." Thomas was shouting now, running out onto the porch. A retired Superior Court judge, on her own property. Elena felt hands on her shoulders, gentle hands, Thomas's hands, checking her for injuries. "I'm okay," she managed to whisper, though she wasn't, not really. "Camera." The camera got it all. "Stay still," Thomas said, his voice fierce with protective anger. "Don't move, we're getting an ambulance." And somewhere above it all, Elena could hear Garrett Holt's voice on his radio, saying those words that would echo through the lawsuit, through the viral video, through the national conversation that would follow. "Dispatch. Send backup. Suspect secured. Suspect secured." A 70-year-old black woman who'd spent 3 decades defending the Constitution, lying on her own porch with taser marks on her body and blood in her mouth, now officially classified as a suspect by an officer who'd violated every right she had. The threshold had been crossed, literally and figuratively, and there was no going back now. Thomas Vance had seen combat in Fallujah and Kandahar. He'd seen things that gave him nightmares years later, had lost friends to IEDs and ambushes, had come home with the kind of trauma that you don't just shake off.
But nothing in his military experience had prepared him for the fury he felt watching a police officer tase his sister-in-law on her own front porch for the crime of being black in an expensive neighborhood. He was on his knees beside Elena, his hands shaking as he checked her pulse, checked her breathing, checked for injuries beyond the obvious taser marks. She was conscious but disoriented, her body still trembling from the electrical shock. There was blood on the porch where her head had hit the wood, and Thomas felt a rage building in him that he had to actively suppress, because getting angry at a cop right now would only make things worse. "Elena, can you hear me?" he asked, keeping his voice calm even though he wanted to scream. "Can you tell me where you're hurt?" "Head," she managed to whisper. "Hit the porch. Everything hurts." Thomas looked up at Garrett Holt, who was standing there with his hand still on his taser, and forced himself to speak in measured tones. "She needs an ambulance. Now. Backup and medical are en route," Garrett said, his voice clipped and defensive. "Sir, I need you to step back from the suspect." "The suspect?" Thomas stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame towering over the officer. "You call her a suspect one more time, and I swear to God." "Thomas," Elena's voice, weak but firm. "Don't." Camera recording. Thomas took a breath, understanding immediately. The camera was recording. Good. Let it record everything. Let it show how calm he was staying, despite every instinct screaming at him to put this cop through the porch railing. "Right," he said quietly. "Officer, my name is Thomas Vance. I'm a combat veteran, United States Army, retired. The woman you just tased is my sister-in-law, Elena Vance, a retired Superior Court judge who owns this property. She was standing on her own porch when you assaulted her. Before backup arrives, I'm going to tell you very clearly, you have made a catastrophic mistake." "Sir, step back from." "Her name is Elena Vance," Thomas continued, his voice carrying to all the neighbors now clustered at the property line. "She's a retired Superior Court judge. She's 70 years old. She has no criminal record. She owns this house."
She was watering her garden when you decided to harass her, and when she exercised her Fourth Amendment right to refuse your unlawful orders, you crossed the threshold of her property without permission and tased her. That camera above the door recorded everything. He saw Garrett's eyes flick up to the ring camera, and saw the moment of realization cross his face. The officer's expression shifted from defensive certainty to something closer to panic, and Thomas knew that Garrett had just understood exactly how much trouble he was in. The sound of sirens cut through the air, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Within minutes, Elena's front yard was full of emergency vehicles, 2 more patrol cars, an ambulance, and a supervisor's vehicle with lieutenant marked on the side. The ambulance crew rushed to Elena immediately, and Thomas stepped back to give them room, but he kept his eyes on Garrett Holt, who was now talking rapidly to a senior officer who just emerged from the supervisor's vehicle. The lieutenant was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen everything twice. His name tag read Williams, and he approached the scene with the careful deliberation of someone who already knew this was going to be a disaster. He spoke briefly with Garrett, and Thomas could see the younger officer gesturing emphatically, building his case, explaining how he'd had reasonable suspicion and how the woman had resisted. Then Lieutenant Williams walked over to Thomas, his expression grave. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Thomas gave him the short version, sticking to facts, keeping his anger in check. Elena Vance, retired Superior Court judge, was watering her garden on her own property. Officer Holt approached her without cause, demanded she leave her porch and provide ID, despite having no legal justification. Elena asserted her Fourth Amendment rights. Holt crossed the threshold of her property without permission, grabbed her, and when she still refused to comply with his unlawful orders, he tased her. She fell and hit her head on the porch. The entire incident was captured by her Ring doorbell camera. Williams's face went pale. "Ring camera?" "Yes, sir. Every second. Crystal clear HD. Audio too." The lieutenant closed his eyes for a moment, and Thomas could practically see him calculating the department's liability. When he opened them again, he looked tired. "Is your sister-in-law willing to make a statement?" "She's going to the hospital," Thomas said flatly. "And then she's going to hire a lawyer. And then your department is going to write the biggest check it's ever written, because what your officer did isn't just wrong, it's a textbook civil rights violation." The paramedics were loading Elena onto a stretcher now, and Thomas moved to follow her. But before he left, he turned back to Williams. "My brother served in Vietnam. He fought for the Constitution. He believed in the system. Elena believed in it too, spent her whole career upholding it. And today, one of your officers tased her on her own porch for having the audacity to be black in a nice neighborhood and know her rights. You might want to get ahead of this, Lieutenant, because when that video goes public, and it will go public, your department is going to have some serious explaining to do." Williams nodded slowly. "Sir, I understand your anger. This shouldn't have happened." "No," Thomas agreed. "It shouldn't have. But it did, and now the whole country is going to see it." He climbed into the ambulance with Elena, holding her hand as the doors closed. Through the window, he could see Garrett Holt standing alone now, other officers deliberately keeping their distance, the universal body language of cops who knew someone had just ended their own career and didn't want to be associated with it. Elena squeezed his hand weakly. "Thomas? Yeah? Tell the lawyer to go for everything," she whispered, her voice stronger now despite the pain. "Badges, pensions, houses, everything. He wanted to make an example of me. We're going to make an example of him." Thomas smiled grimly. "You got it, Judge." The ambulance pulled away from Magnolia Lane, leaving behind a scene that would be analyzed and debated for months to come. Behind them, Lieutenant Williams was already on his phone with the chief of police, starting the conversation that would eventually lead to press conferences, policy changes, and a reckoning with the kind of policing that had just been captured in crystal clear high definition for the world to see. And on the porch of 847 Magnolia Lane, a small pool of blood marked the spot where a retired judge had been violently assaulted for the crime of standing on her own property and believing that the Constitution applied to her too. The video went viral at 6:47 p.m. that same evening, less than 7 hours after the incident. Martha Reynolds, Elena's neighbor, had been the one to post it, sharing the Ring camera footage to her Facebook page with a simple caption, "This happened today to my neighbor, a retired judge, on her own front porch. Watch and share." By midnight, it had been viewed 3 million times. By morning, it was trending on every social media platform, picked up by local news, then national news, then international outlets. The footage was impossible to look away from. A woman in a college sweatshirt, standing calmly on her porch, articulating her Fourth Amendment rights in clear, professional language, while an officer grew increasingly aggressive. The moment when she stated her full name and position, "My name is Elena Marie Vance. I am a retired Superior Court judge," became a rallying cry. The moment when the taser fired and she collapsed, her head hitting the porch with that sickening crack, made viewers gasp and recoil. But it wasn't just the violence that made the video so powerful. It was the clear documentation of everything that came before it. Elena hadn't been aggressive. She hadn't been threatening. She'd been standing perfectly still, her hands visible, her voice calm, citing legal precedent and constitutional protections. There was no ambiguity here, no need to wonder if the officer had felt threatened or if the situation had escalated too quickly to control. This was a retired judge, peacefully asserting her rights on her own property, being punished with violence for refusing to submit to illegal authority. The Magnolia Lane community responded first. By Sunday morning, Elena's front yard was filled with flowers, cards, and signs. "We stand with Judge Vance" became the common refrain. Martha organized a neighborhood meeting that evening, and every single resident on the street showed up. They signed a petition demanding Officer Holt's immediate termination. They pooled money for Elena's legal defense, though she would later politely decline it, knowing she wouldn't need it. And on the porch of 847 Magnolia Lane, a small pool of blood marked the spot where a retired judge had been violently assaulted for the crime of standing on her own property and believing that the Constitution applied to her too. The video went viral at 6:47 p.m. that same evening, less than 7 hours after the incident. Martha Reynolds, Elena's neighbor, had been the one to post it, sharing the Ring camera footage to her Facebook page with a simple caption, "This happened today to my neighbor, a retired judge, on her own front porch. Watch and share." By midnight, it had been viewed 3 million times. By morning, it was trending on every social media platform, picked up by local news, then national news, then international outlets. The footage was impossible to look away from. A woman in a college sweatshirt, standing calmly on her porch, articulating her Fourth Amendment rights in clear, professional language, while an officer grew increasingly aggressive. The moment when she stated her full name and position, "My name is Elena Marie Vance. I am a retired Superior Court judge," became a rallying cry. The moment when the taser fired and she collapsed, her head hitting the porch with that sickening crack, made viewers gasp and recoil. But it wasn't just the violence that made the video so powerful. It was the clear documentation of everything that came before it. Elena hadn't been aggressive. She hadn't been threatening. She'd been standing perfectly still, her hands visible, her voice calm, citing legal precedent and constitutional protections. There was no ambiguity here, no need to wonder if the officer had felt threatened or if the situation had escalated too quickly to control. This was a retired judge, peacefully asserting her rights on her own property, being punished with violence for refusing to submit to illegal authority. The Magnolia Lane community responded first. By Sunday morning, Elena's front yard was filled with flowers, cards, and signs. "We stand with Judge Vance" became the common refrain. Martha organized a neighborhood meeting that evening, and every single resident on the street showed up. They signed a petition demanding Officer Holt's immediate termination. They pooled money for Elena's legal defense, though she would later politely decline it, knowing she wouldn't need it. And on the porch of 847 Magnolia Lane, A small pool of blood marked the spot where a retired judge had been violently assaulted for the crime of standing on her own property and believing that the Constitution applied to her too. The video went viral at 6:47 p.m. that same evening, less than 7 hours after the incident. Martha Reynolds, Elena's neighbor, had been the one to post it, sharing the Ring camera footage to her Facebook page with a simple caption, "This happened today to my neighbor, a retired judge, on her own front porch. Watch and share." By midnight, it had been viewed 3 million times. By morning, it was trending on every social media platform, picked up by local news, then national news, then international outlets. The footage was impossible to look away from. A woman in a college sweatshirt, standing calmly on her porch, articulating her Fourth Amendment rights in clear, professional language, while an officer grew increasingly aggressive. The moment when she stated her full name and position, "My name is Elena Marie Vance. I am a retired Superior Court judge," became a rallying cry. The moment when the taser fired and she collapsed, her head hitting the porch with that sickening crack, made viewers gasp and recoil. But it wasn't just the violence that made the video so powerful. It was the clear documentation of everything that came before it. Elena hadn't been aggressive. She hadn't been threatening. She'd been standing perfectly still, her hands visible, her voice calm, citing legal precedent and constitutional protections. There was no ambiguity here, no need to wonder if the officer had felt threatened or if the situation had escalated too quickly to control. This was a retired judge, peacefully asserting her rights on her own property, being punished with violence for refusing to submit to illegal authority. The Magnolia Lane community responded first. By Sunday morning, Elena's front yard was filled with flowers, cards, and signs. "We stand with Judge Vance" became the common refrain. Martha organized a neighborhood meeting that evening, and every single resident on the street showed up. They signed a petition demanding Officer Holt's immediate termination. They pooled money for Elena's legal defense, though she would later politely decline it, knowing she wouldn't need it. They organized a rotation schedule to make sure someone was always available to help her with grocery shopping, yard work, anything she needed during her recovery. Tom and Susan from across the street gave tearful interviews to the local news, explaining how they'd welcomed Elena to the neighborhood, how she'd been nothing but kind and friendly, and how the idea that she needed to be investigated was absurd on its face. "She's our neighbor," Susan said, wiping her eyes. "She bakes cookies for the block party. She helped my daughter with her college application essay. The idea that any officer would see her as a threat is it's racism. There's no other word for it." The broader community response came next. By Monday, there were protests outside the Magnolia County Police Department headquarters. Not the kind of destructive riots that Fox News loved to feature, but organized, peaceful demonstrations led by civil rights groups, veterans organizations, and legal advocacy nonprofits. People carried signs with Elena's photo, with quotes from the Constitution, with demands for accountability. Veterans showed up in full dress uniform, standing silent and stoic, holding American flags and signs that read, "She stood for the Constitution, will you?" The legal community response was perhaps the most damning. Retired judges from across the state issued a joint statement expressing their outrage. The State Bar Association called for an independent investigation. Law professors wrote op-eds explaining in painstaking detail every violation that had occurred, using the video as a teaching tool for what officers should never, ever do. One article, published in a prestigious legal journal and shared widely on social media, broke down the incident second by second, citing every relevant case law precedent and explaining why Garrett Holt's actions weren't just wrong but egregiously, obviously, indefensibly wrong. The police union initially tried to defend Holt, releasing a statement about the difficult split-second decisions officers have to make and the dangers of Monday morning quarterbacking. But that statement was met with immediate backlash. Within hours, union leadership was backtracking, clarifying that they weren't defending this specific action, but simply speaking generally about the challenges of police work. By Tuesday, they'd gone silent entirely, no longer willing to associate themselves with a case that was so clearly indefensible. Social media became a battleground. The hashtag Justice for Judge Vance trended for 3 straight days. Legal analysis videos broke down every aspect of the encounter. Civil rights advocates used the footage as Exhibit A in discussions about qualified immunity reform. Conservative commentators who normally defended law enforcement found themselves in awkward positions, trying to reconcile their usual pro-police stance with video evidence of a clear constitutional violation against a judge who'd spent her career upholding law and order. Some tried to find ways to blame Elena. Why didn't she just show her ID? Why did she have to quote the Constitution instead of cooperating? Why make it difficult for the officer? But these arguments gained little traction because the video made it impossible to pretend this was anything other than what it was. Elena had been calm, professional, and legally correct. Holt had been aggressive, illegal, and ultimately violent. There was no both sidesing this incident. The viral spread had another effect. It brought forward other victims. Within days of the video going public, more than a dozen people came forward with complaints about Officer Garrett Holt. Similar stories of racial profiling, aggressive behavior, unlawful demands for ID. One black teenager described being pulled over 3 times in 1 month, each time by Holt, each time without legitimate cause. A Hispanic family detailed how Holt had shown up at their home, demanding to see immigration papers despite having no legal authority to do so. A Middle Eastern business owner talked about being subjected to invasive questioning about terrorism, simply for opening a restaurant in a predominantly white neighborhood. The pattern was undeniable, and it raised uncomfortable questions. How had Holt kept his badge despite all these complaints? Why hadn't the department's Internal Affairs Division taken action? What kind of culture existed within the Magnolia County Police Department that allowed an officer with this many red flags to keep patrolling the streets? Local news stations camped outside Elena's house, though she declined all interview requests through her lawyer. She was recovering at home now, the hospital having released her after determining she'd suffered a minor concussion, severe bruising, and trauma, but no permanent physical damage. The emotional damage was another matter, though Elena kept that private. She'd spent 30 years believing the system worked, and in one afternoon on her own porch, that belief had been shattered. The Magnolia County Police Department held a press conference on Wednesday, 4 days after the incident. Chief Robert Morrison stood at a podium, looking like he'd aged a decade in less than a week. He announced that Officer Garrett Holt had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. He expressed sympathy for Judge Vance and acknowledged that the video raised serious concerns. He promised a thorough review of department policies and procedures. He said all the right things, but his body language suggested he knew it wasn't enough. The district attorney's office announced they were reviewing the case for possible criminal charges against Holt. Civil rights organizations called for federal intervention. The FBI opened a preliminary inquiry into whether civil rights violations had occurred. The machinery of accountability was grinding into motion, slowly but inevitably. And through it all, the video kept playing, kept being shared, kept forcing people to confront the gap between American ideals and American reality. This was supposed to be a country where your home was your castle, where the Constitution protected everyone equally, where you couldn't be assaulted for asserting your rights. The footage of Elena Vance being tased on her own porch was undeniable evidence that for too many people, those protections existed more in theory than in practice. By the end of the first week, the video had been viewed over 50 million times worldwide. It had been shown in journalism classes, law school seminars, police academy training sessions, as an example of exactly what not to do. It had become a cultural touchstone, a rallying point, a moment that would be referenced for years to come in discussions about police reform, civil rights, and the ongoing struggle to make America live up to its founding principles. And in a hospital bed, then at home recovering, Elena Vance watched it all unfold and made a decision. This wasn't going to be just about her. This was going to be about every person who'd ever been profiled, harassed, or brutalized for having the audacity to assert their constitutional rights. The lawsuit she was about to file wasn't just about monetary damages. It was about setting a precedent that would protect the next person, and the next, and the next. The evidence was undeniable. Now it was time to make sure the accountability was too. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks after the incident, and it was a masterclass in legal precision. Elena had hired Margaret Chin, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country, a woman who'd built her reputation, taking on police departments and winning. Margaret didn't just file a complaint, she filed a comprehensive legal document that would become required reading in law schools for years to come. The defendants were numerous. Officer Garrett Holt personally, the Magnolia County Police Department, the county itself, Police Chief Robert Morrison in his official capacity, and 3 supervisors who'd ignored or dismissed previous complaints about Holt's conduct. The legal theory was straightforward but devastating. This wasn't just one bad officer making one bad decision. This was systemic failure that enabled a pattern of civil rights violations. The complaint opened with a detailed recitation of facts, each one supported by timestamps from the Ring camera footage. The precision was surgical. At 11:34 a.m., Officer Holt first observed Mrs. Vance gardening on her property. At 11:47 a.m., he approached without legal justification. At 11:49 a.m., he demanded identification without probable cause. At 11:52 a.m., he issued an unlawful order to leave her property. At 11:53 a.m., he crossed the threshold of her home without permission, warrant, or exigent circumstances. At 11:54 a.m., he deployed his taser against a non-threatening, non-resisting citizen on her own property. Each timestamp corresponded to a specific constitutional violation. The Fourth Amendment claim focused on the unlawful seizure. Holt had no reasonable suspicion to stop her, no probable cause to detain her, and no authority to enter her property. The 14th Amendment claim addressed equal protection. The complaint laid out in detail how Holt. The motion was poorly reasoned and tone-deaf, and Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to the police chief, denied it from the bench with barely concealed contempt. "The court has reviewed the video evidence," she said dryly. "This was not a split-second decision. This was a sustained violation of clearly established constitutional rights over the course of several minutes." Motion denied. Discovery was brutal for the defendants. Margaret Chen subpoenaed Holt's entire personnel file, all training records, all internal communications about previous complaints. What emerged painted a picture of a department more concerned with protecting officers than protecting citizens. Internal emails showed supervisors discussing Holt's attitude problem and his issues with minorities, but consistently deciding that termination would be too extreme or not worth the union fight. One particularly damning email exchange showed Holt's sergeant recommending termination after a particularly egregious stop-and-frisk incident, only to be overruled by a lieutenant who wrote, "He's a little rough around the edges, but he gets results. We can't afford to lose bodies right now." That email alone was worth millions in damages because it showed consciousness of the problem and deliberate choice to ignore it. Depositions were even worse. Holt himself was a disaster on the stand. He couldn't explain what reasonable suspicion he'd had. He couldn't articulate what crime he was investigating. He kept falling back on vague claims about suspicious behavior and officer safety that didn't hold up under even gentle questioning. When Margaret played the Ring camera footage during his deposition and asked him to identify the specific moment when he felt his safety was threatened by a 70-year-old woman standing on her porch, he couldn't answer. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds on the deposition transcript, a lifetime in legal terms. Chief Morrison's deposition wasn't much better. He admitted under oath that he was aware of previous complaints against Holt. He admitted that the department's internal affairs process was not as robust as it could be. He admitted that officers received minimal training on constitutional rights and de-escalation. By the end of his deposition, even the county's own lawyers looked defeated.
The medical evidence supported Elena's claims of emotional distress. She'd developed anxiety, particularly around police officers. She'd started therapy to address what her psychologist diagnosed as PTSD, triggered by the assault. The woman who'd spent 30 years enforcing the law now flinched when she saw a police cruiser. The irony was not lost on anyone. But perhaps the most powerful evidence came from Elena's own deposition. Unlike Holt, who'd been evasive and defensive, Elena was calm, precise, and devastatingly credible. She walked through every moment of the encounter, explaining her legal reasoning, quoting the exact cases she'd had in mind when she cited the Fourth Amendment. She described the pain of the taser, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal on her own property, the shattering of her belief that the system she'd served would protect her. When Margaret asked why she was pursuing this lawsuit, Elena's answer became the soundbite that ran on every news channel. Because the Constitution isn't supposed to be optional. Because your home is your castle isn't supposed to depend on your skin color. Because if this can happen to a retired judge with every advantage, education, resources, knowledge of the law, then it's happening every day to people who don't have those advantages. And that's not the America my husband fought for. That's not the justice system I dedicated my life to. If I don't stand up now, when I have the evidence and the platform and the resources to do it, then I'm complicit in the system that allows this to happen. Settlement negotiations began 7 months after the lawsuit was filed. The county's insurance carrier had seen enough. The Ring camera footage was too clear. The pattern of previous complaints was too extensive. The constitutional violations were too obvious. They couldn't risk a jury trial, not with public sentiment where it was. Not with the evidence so overwhelmingly on Elena's side. The initial settlement offer was $3 million. Margaret rejected it immediately. The county came back with $5 million. Margaret countered with $9 million. They settled at $8.5 million, the exact amount Elena had demanded in her complaint.
The county also agreed to specific reforms, mandatory training on constitutional rights, an independent review of all use of force incidents, a civilian oversight board with real investigative authority, and the immediate termination of Officer Garrett Holt with forfeiture of his pension. That last provision was unusual and legally complex, but Elena had insisted on it. Holt wasn't just losing his job, he was losing his retirement security. At 43 years old with 12 years of service, he'd been on track for a comfortable pension. Now he'd get nothing. His police career was over, his financial future in ruins, his name forever associated with one of the most clear-cut civil rights violations in recent memory. When the settlement was announced, reactions divided along predictable lines. Civil rights advocates called it a victory, but noted that money alone didn't change culture. Police unions complained that it would make officers afraid to do their jobs, though legal experts quickly debunked that argument. Officers should be afraid to violate constitutional rights. That's the point. Community members in Magnolia County celebrated, though many noted that $8.5 million was coming from taxpayer funds, not from the officers who'd enabled Holt's behavior. Elena donated $2 million of the settlement to organizations working on police reform and civil rights advocacy. She set aside another $1 million for a scholarship fund for law students from marginalized communities. The rest she kept, not because she needed it. Her judge's pension was more than adequate, but because accepting less would have suggested that what happened to her wasn't worth the full measure of accountability. The $8.5 million hammer had fallen. But for Elena, the real victory wasn't the money. It was the precedent. The message sent to every officer who thought the badge made them above the Constitution. Violate someone's rights, especially someone who knows their rights, and you'll pay for it. Not just professionally, but personally. Not just temporarily, but permanently. The system had failed to protect her, on her own porch. But the system, through the courts, through the lawsuit, through the clear documentation of wrongdoing, had ultimately delivered something close to justice. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo the trauma. But it was accountability. And in a world where police officers rarely faced real consequences for constitutional violations, that mattered. 18 months after the incident, Garrett Holt was working the night shift at a warehouse on the industrial edge of the county, loading boxes onto pallets for $16.50 an hour. It was a long fall from the authority and respect that came with a badge, from the $68,000 salary and benefits he'd earned as a police officer, from the pension he'd been counting on for retirement. Every muscle in his 44-year-old body ached by the end of his shift, and every week he wrote a check for his court-ordered restitution payment, $2,500 a month for the next 15 years, his personal contribution to the $8.5 million settlement that he'd pay until he was nearly 60. His wife had left him 6 months after the lawsuit was settled. She'd stood by him initially, believed his version of events, trusted that he'd been doing his job. But as the details came out, as the Ring camera footage played on every news channel, as the depositions revealed his pattern of racial profiling, she'd reached her breaking point. The divorce had been quick and brutal. She'd gotten the house, or what was left of it after the liens from the settlement were satisfied, and custody of their 2 kids. Garrett got supervised visitation every other weekend, and a studio apartment that smelled like mildew. His name was permanently on the National Decertification Index, which meant he could never work in law enforcement again, anywhere in the country. He'd applied for private security jobs, but his background check killed every application. Who wanted to hire a security guard whose Google results showed him tasing a retired judge on her own porch? He tried to use a different name on his resume, but that felt too much like fraud, and he didn't need any more legal problems. The worst part wasn't the money or the job or even the divorce. It was the recognition. Someone at the warehouse had figured out who he was, and within a week, everyone knew. They didn't say anything directly. He wasn't worth the confrontation, but he could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispers when he walked past. The black workers gave him particularly wide berth, and he couldn't blame them. He was toxic, marked, a living example of what happened when ego and prejudice overwhelmed common sense and constitutional restraint. Late at night, alone in his apartment, Garrett sometimes thought about that day on Magnolia Lane. He'd replayed it 1,000 times in his mind, looking for the moment when he could have made a different choice. If he'd just driven past when he first saw her gardening, if he'd accepted her explanation that she lived there and moved on, if he'd called a supervisor when she started citing the Fourth Amendment, instead of letting his ego take control, if he'd walked away when she mentioned the Ring camera. But he hadn't made any of those choices. He'd let his bias and his pride override his judgment, and now he was paying for it in ways he'd never imagined. The 3 minutes on Elena Vance's porch had cost him his career, his marriage, his home, his reputation, and his future. $8.5 million in damages, and his share of personal liability would follow him until he was an old man. He'd tried to apologize once, sending a letter through his lawyer. Elena's response, also through her lawyer, was brief. Mr. Holt's apology is noted. It changes nothing. That stung more than he'd expected. He'd hoped for forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement that he'd expressed remorse. Instead, he got the same cold legal precision she'd used on her porch that day, and he realized that some things couldn't be apologized away. Meanwhile, Elena Vance had become a national figure in the conversation about police reform. She'd started accepting speaking engagements at law schools, police academies, civil rights organizations. Her message was consistent. The Constitution applies to everyone, your home is your castle, and knowing your rights isn't a crime. She'd turn 72 soon, but her voice had a new urgency, a new authority born from lived experience rather than just legal theory. She'd worked with state legislators to pass Elena's Law, a bill requiring more robust tracking of officer complaints and mandatory intervention when patterns emerged. The law wasn't perfect. Police unions had watered it down in committee, but it was something. It meant the next Garrett Holt might get stopped before he could tase the next Elena Vance. She'd also joined the board of the ACLU and become a frequent consultant for police departments, trying to reform their training and culture. Some departments invited her grudgingly, pushed by court orders or public pressure. Others invited her genuinely, recognizing that she offered something valuable, the perspective of someone who'd spent 30 years inside the system and then been victimized by it. She could speak both languages, law enforcement and civil rights, in ways that few others could. Her testimony before a congressional committee on qualified immunity reform had gone viral, nearly as viral as the original Ring camera footage. She'd brought a laptop and played the video for the representatives, making them watch as she was tased on her own porch. "This is what qualified immunity protects," she'd said quietly. "This is what happens when officers know they can violate rights without personal consequences. And this is what needs to change." Her home on Magnolia Lane had become a kind of landmark. Tour buses didn't stop there. Elena would have hated that. But locals knew the house, knew the story. The porch had been refinished, the blood stain removed, but the Ring camera was still there, still recording, a permanent reminder that documentation matters, that evidence matters, that sunlight really is the best disinfectant. Martha next door was still her closest friend. They had coffee every Sunday morning, sitting on Elena's porch, the same porch where the assault had occurred, and talking about everything except the incident, unless Elena brought it up first. Martha had become fiercely protective, had actually chased away a reporter who'd tried to doorstep Elena for a comment. "This is her home," Martha had told the reporter firmly. "She has a right to peace here. Leave her alone." Thomas still visited regularly, though he'd moved back to his own place in Colorado. He'd been the one to suggest Elena write a book about her experience, but she'd declined. "I'm not ready," she'd told him. "Maybe someday. But right now, living through it once was enough. I don't need to relive it on the page." The Magnolia County Police Department had undergone significant reforms, though change was slow and incomplete. Chief Morrison had retired under pressure, replaced by an outsider with a reputation for community policing. The Civilian Oversight Board had real power, and had already forced policy changes around use of force and racial profiling. Officer complaints were now tracked in a database that flagged patterns before they could escalate. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Some officers resented the changes, seeing them as a response to one bad incident that was being blown out of proportion. But the smarter ones understood that Garrett Holt's actions had endangered all of them, and had undermined public trust in ways that would take years to rebuild. The Ring camera footage was now shown in every training session, as an example of what not to do, and new recruits were tested on their knowledge of Fourth Amendment limitations. The message was clear. This can never happen again. On the anniversary of the incident, Elena did something she hadn't done in 18 months. She gave an interview, not to a national media outlet or a legal publication, but to the local Magnolia County newspaper, the paper that served her community. She wanted her neighbors to hear directly from her. "People ask me if I regret moving to Magnolia Lane," she told the reporter, sitting in her living room surrounded by her framed diplomas and awards. "The answer is no. This is my home. I earned it. I love it. What happened on my porch doesn't change that. What happened on my porch was wrong, illegal, and motivated by bias. But my community stood by me. My neighbors supported me. And ultimately, the system, flawed as it is, delivered accountability." "What do you want people to take away from your experience?" the reporter asked. Elena thought for a moment. "Know your rights. Assert your rights. Document everything. And understand that the Constitution isn't self-executing. It only protects you if you're willing to stand up for it. Even when, especially when, that means standing up to government authority. My husband fought for those rights overseas. I fought for them in the courtroom. And that day on my porch, I fought for them as a citizen. That fight isn't always safe or easy, but it's always necessary." The interview ran with a photo of Elena standing on her porch, the same porch where Garrett Holt had tased her. She looked strong, dignified, unbroken. The caption read, "Judge Elena Vance, still standing." Because that was the real ending to this story. Not the settlement, not the reforms, not even the accountability. The real ending was that Elena Vance was still standing, still fighting, still believing that the Constitution meant something even when the system failed to protect it. Garrett Holt had tried to make her submit, to make her comply with illegal authority, to punish her for asserting her rights. He'd failed. She'd stood her ground, absorbed his worst, and emerged not just alive but stronger, more determined, more convinced than ever that the fight for civil rights wasn't over and might never be over. And somewhere in a warehouse across town, loading boxes onto pallets, Garrett Holt finished his shift and drove home to his studio apartment, carrying the weight of consequences he'd never imagined and a future he'd destroyed, with 3 minutes of bias, ego, and constitutional ignorance captured in crystal clear HD. Accountability served. Justice, imperfect but real, delivered. And a message sent to every officer who thought the badge made them above the law. It doesn't. It never did. And if you violate someone's rights, especially someone who knows their rights, you'll pay for it. Not just professionally, but personally. Not just temporarily, but for the rest of your life.